Commander Xalvik of the Vrogan Dominion stood tall, his scaled arms crossed over his chest as he observed the human training field with barely concealed amusement. He had traveled across countless war zones, witnessed the might of the most powerful warriors in the galaxy, and crushed enemies under the unrelenting force of the Dominion's armies. Yet here he was, watching the so-called legendary human warriors go through their training, and all he could feel was disappointment. The training area was primitive. Crude metal structures, simple obstacle courses, and groups of humans engaged in what seemed like slow, inefficient combat drills. The soldiers moved with discipline, but their strikes lacked the sheer force he was accustomed to seeing among his own kind. Their weapons were nothing special, their bodies unremarkable, and their techniques looked outdated. He had expected something extraordinary, something that justified the whispers he had heard of human resilience, of their ability to hold back enemies far superior to them. Instead, all he saw was a race of fragile creatures pretending to be warriors. Xalvik let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he turned toward the human standing beside him. Captain Reynolds. The human officer had been quiet throughout the entire observation, arms behind his back, face unreadable. His expression didn't change, even as Xalvik scoffed. "This is it," the Vrogan commander said, his voice laced with mockery. "This is your training." He gestured toward the field, where two humans were locked in a slow, methodical hand-to-hand combat drill. "I expected something more." His sharp yellow eyes narrowed. "Something worthy of the stories I'd heard about your kind." Captain Reynolds didn't flinch at the insult. He didn't rise to defend his soldiers, didn't argue, didn't explain. Instead, he simply tilted his head slightly and nodded toward the field. "Watch a little longer," he said. His voice was calm, steady, unbothered. That response irritated Xalvik. He had spent his life among warriors, among soldiers who prided themselves on their strength. The Vrogan were a species bred for war, their bodies armored with thick, natural plating, their claws capable of tearing through flesh with ease. They were superior in every physical way to humans. Why then, did this man not seem the least bit concerned by his criticism? Was he too proud to admit their weakness, or did he know something Xalvik didn't? Xalvik exhaled sharply and returned his gaze to the field, already prepared to see more of the same. Slow, unimpressive fighting techniques, basic maneuvers, and a complete lack of true aggression. But then something changed. One of the human instructors stepped forward, barking out an order. The tone of his voice sent a ripple through the soldiers, and in an instant, the entire energy of the training ground shifted. The casual, almost sluggish movements of the humans disappeared. Their stances changed, became tighter, more controlled. Their expressions hardened, their breathing slowed, and an eerie stillness settled over them. Then, without warning, they moved. Xalvik barely had time to process what was happening. One moment, they were standing in formation. The next, they were attacking. Not with brute force, not with the raw power that he had expected from any trained soldier, but with something far more terrifying: precision. Their strikes were not aimed for dominance. They were aimed to kill. Every movement was calculated, every attack designed not to overpower but to eliminate. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary displays of strength. They fought like creatures that had learned, over countless battles, that brute force alone was never enough. Xalvik's amusement faded. He had underestimated them. That much was clear. But what unsettled him more than their efficiency was the way they fought. He had seen species that relied on their superior speed, their natural weapons, their advanced technology. The Vrogan themselves had conquered countless worlds through sheer martial prowess. But the humans, they did not fight with the raw instincts of predators, nor did they fight with the arrogance of conquerors. They fought with experience. Reynolds spoke again, his voice even. "Now you see," he said, watching the field alongside Xalvik. "We don't train to fight like you do. We don't train to conquer." His eyes flickered toward the Vrogan commander. "We train to survive." Xalvik's mind raced. Survival. That was the key difference. The Vrogan fought for glory, for expansion, for dominance. Humans fought because they had to. He had mocked their training because it didn't resemble the grand war academies of the Dominion. But now he realized why. Humans didn't train to fight like the strongest. They trained to fight against the strongest. He turned his attention back to the battlefield. The human soldiers continued their drills, their movements becoming more fluid, more unpredictable. One moment, they moved as a unit, perfect in their coordination. The next, they scattered, adapting instantly to new threats, changing their strategies on the fly. There was no rigid structure, no predictable pattern. Every attack was designed not to overpower the enemy, but to find their weakness and exploit it. It was something Salvik had never seen before, a style of combat that did not rely on superior numbers or brute strength, but on the cold, ruthless efficiency of those who had spent centuries fighting wars no one else had survived. A chill ran through Salvik's body as realization settled in. The reason human training looked unimpressive at first was because it was not meant to impress. It was not meant for display, for intimidation, for spectacle. It was meant for one thing only: to kill, and to keep killing until nothing was left. The Vrogan commander clenched his jaw, suddenly uncertain. If this was how they trained their soldiers, then what kind of enemies had forced them to train this way? What had humanity faced that made them abandon all forms of traditional warfare and turn their entire combat doctrine into something so brutally efficient? He turned to Reynolds, his voice quieter now. "You don't fight like warriors." His reptilian eyes studied the human officer, searching for an answer. "You fight like survivors." Reynolds met his gaze, the shadow of something unreadable flickering across his face. "That's because we are." Salvik said nothing. His mind was already racing, already reevaluating everything he had assumed about humanity. He had come here expecting to laugh at their weakness, to confirm that the stories of human resilience were nothing more than myths. But now he was beginning to understand. Humans were not weak. They were not slow. They were not unremarkable. They were something far worse. They were prepared. For what? Salvik didn't yet know. But as he watched the human soldiers move with the cold efficiency of those who had already seen the worst the universe had to offer, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was coming. Salvik couldn't shake the unease settling deep within him as he continued to watch the human soldiers train. It wasn't their speed, nor their strength, that disturbed him. It was the way they fought, the way they moved. There was no hesitation, no wasted effort. Every attack was calculated, every maneuver stripped of unnecessary motion. The Vrogan had always believed that war was about dominance, about proving one's superiority through brute force. But what he saw before him was something entirely different. This was not the training of warriors seeking glory. This was the training of creatures who had lived on the edge of annihilation for far too long. They didn't fight to win. They fought to survive. The realization sent a cold shiver through his scaled spine. What kind of species drilled their soldiers not for victory, but for desperation? What had forced humans to refine their combat into something so brutal, so merciless? He turned to Reynolds, his voice quieter than before. "Who taught you to fight this way?" The human officer didn't look at him, his eyes still locked on the training ground, watching his soldiers move like phantoms, adapting to threats that didn't even exist yet. "Experience," Reynolds said simply. His tone carried no arrogance, no pride, only a heavy weight that Salvik couldn't quite place. The word lingered in the air, and Salvik found himself gripping his belt tighter, his claws digging into the leather. He had fought in countless battles, had seen entire civilizations fall before the might of the Vrogan Dominion. Yet never had he encountered something like this. There was no posturing, no displays of strength meant to intimidate. The humans weren't training for war, as the Vrogan knew it. They were training for something worse. And if what he saw here was just a glimpse of their preparation, then the galaxy had severely underestimated what humanity was truly capable of. Zelvik finally tore his gaze away, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't silence the nagging thought creeping into his mind. What exactly had humans been fighting all this time? And more importantly, had they already fought something that the rest of the galaxy hadn't even seen yet? Zelvik stood in silence, watching the human soldiers continue their relentless training, but his mind was no longer focused on their movements. It was consumed by a growing sense of unease. The Vrogan had fought many species, crushed countless enemies under the weight of their superior strength, and yet never had he encountered an opponent that trained like this. The humans weren't preparing for conventional war, nor were they honing their skills for conquest. Their fighting style was something different, something that felt older, like it had been shaped by countless battles where survival was never guaranteed. He had dismissed their initial training as weak, but now he saw the terrifying truth. Their techniques weren't designed to overpower an enemy, but to outblast them, to wear them down, to fight in ways that no predictable military force could counter. Zelvik had spent his entire life believing that battle was a display of power, that the strongest species always won, but watching these humans train made him question everything he had ever known. This wasn't just combat training. This was the conditioning of a species that had been at war with something relentless, something that had pushed them to refine every instinct, every movement, into pure survival. He glanced at Reynolds again, studying the human's unreadable expression. He had assumed that the Dominion's wars had been the greatest conflicts in the galaxy, but what if he was wrong? What if the humans had already fought something far worse? Something no one else had ever faced. The thought sent an uncomfortable chill down his spine. Who was your greatest enemy? Zelvik asked, his voice quieter now, more cautious. Reynolds finally looked at him, and for the first time, Zelvik saw something in his eyes that unsettled him. A shadow, a memory, something buried deep beneath that calm exterior. The human exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting back toward the training field. "You wouldn't want to know," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Zelvik clenched his jaw, his instincts screaming at him that there was more to this than just training, more to humanity's history than the galaxy understood. And for the first time, the mighty Vrogan commander felt something unfamiliar creeping into his thoughts. Fear. Zelvik had faced countless enemies, had stood on the battlefields of dying worlds, had seen civilizations crumble beneath the might of the Vrogan Dominion. He had never known fear, not true fear. And yet, as he watched the humans move with an eerie, calculated efficiency, as he listened to the quiet, unsettling weight in Captain Reynolds' voice, he felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. These were not warriors who fought for conquest, nor soldiers bred for glory. These were survivors of something far worse. Zelvik's mind raced with possibilities, his sharp reptilian eyes narrowing as he studied the humans more closely. What could have forged them into this? What enemy had shaped their training into something so ruthless, so instinctive, that even their drills felt like a desperate battle for survival? He had come here expecting to see the weakness of a lesser species, but now he realized the truth. Humans were not weak. They were conditioned, hardened by something that had forced them to throw away traditional warfare and embrace something far deadlier. He thought of the stories, the whispers of human resilience, of battles where they had held the line against impossible odds. At the time he had laughed, dismissing them as exaggerations, but now he wasn't so sure. He turned to Reynolds again, his voice lower, almost hesitant. "What happened to your people?" The human officer didn't answer immediately. He simply watched his soldiers move with quiet intensity, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching behind his back. When he finally spoke, it was with the weight of someone who had seen things no one should ever have to see. "We learned the hard way," Reynolds said, his voice cold, distant, "that in the end, it's not the strongest who survive. It's the ones who refuse to die." Zelvik felt a chill creep up his spine. There was something wrong with that statement, something that suggested humanity had faced an enemy that didn't care about strength, about numbers, about power. An enemy that had only one rule: survival, at any cost. And suddenly, for the first time in his long career as a warrior, Salvek wasn't sure if the Vrogan Dominion was ready for what humanity had already endured. Salvek couldn't shake the growing unease clawing at the back of his mind. The way Reynolds spoke, the weight in his words, was not the voice of a man boasting about his people's strength. It was the voice of someone who had seen horror, someone who had endured. Salvek had fought against enemies who screamed their war cries before battle, who bared their fangs, who reveled in destruction. But humans were different. There was no arrogance in their training, no displays of dominance. Only preparation. Cold, calculated, unrelenting. Salvek had assumed that his kind, the Vrogan, were the pinnacle of warriors in the galaxy, that their natural armor, their superior strength, and their sheer aggression made them unmatched. But as he watched the humans move, adjusting to invisible threats, their attacks designed to exploit weaknesses rather than overpower, he realized that he had been blind. Strength alone didn't make a species dangerous. It was adaptability, ruthlessness, and something far worse, necessity. The humans didn't fight like conquerors, like soldiers who had been trained for glory. They fought like people who had been forced to claw their way out of extinction, who had been tempered by something so brutal that survival had become their very nature. Salvek's throat tightened as a terrible thought formed in his mind. What if humanity had never been fighting for dominance? What if they had always been fighting against something? And what if that something wasn't gone? His gaze flickered back to Reynolds, who remained silent, watching his soldiers with an expression that was unreadable yet heavy with knowledge. Salvek wanted to demand answers, to understand what had shaped these people into what they had become, but a deep part of him hesitated, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Salvek's mind was a battlefield of doubts and unanswered questions. The more he observed the humans, the more unsettling it became. Their movements weren't just precise. They were instinctive, drilled so deeply into their bones that it was as natural as breathing. They weren't merely training, they were reliving. Every motion, every adjustment in stance, every flicker of their eyes scanning for unseen threats, it was the behavior of those who had spent generations teetering on the edge of annihilation. What enemy had forced them to become this? Salvek had assumed the Dominion's wars were the pinnacle of conflict, that no species had faced greater battles than the Vrogan. But now, watching humanity's grim efficiency, he realized the horrifying possibility. Humanity had survived something far worse than war. The idea gnawed at him, refusing to be dismissed. The galaxy had always underestimated humans, mocking their fragility, their lack of natural armor, their unimpressive physicality. But what if that fragility had been a curse they had been forced to overcome? What if their history wasn't one of dominance, but one of desperation? He turned to Reynolds once more, this time with the weight of true curiosity. And fear. You fight like something is still hunting you, Salvek muttered, his voice quieter than he intended. Reynolds didn't look at him, but there was the faintest shift in his expression, a flicker of something dark and unspoken in his eyes. Maybe it is, Reynolds said, and the simplicity of those 3 words made Salvek's stomach twist. He had fought many wars, crushed many civilizations, but for the first time, he felt like a child peering into the abyss of something beyond his understanding. If humans had fought something so terrible that they still trained like this, so prepared, so relentless, then the real question wasn't whether humanity was strong enough for the Dominion. The real question was whether the Dominion was strong enough for whatever had made humanity this way. Salvek felt something cold settle deep in his gut, an unfamiliar sensation for a warrior who had never feared battle. He had always believed war was a contest of power, that the strongest species would always rise above the weak. But standing here, watching humanity train with an almost mechanical precision, he realized he had been wrong. Power wasn't what made a species truly dangerous. It was what they had survived. And humans had survived something the rest of the galaxy had never even imagined. The way they moved, the way their eyes constantly scanned for threats, even in a controlled environment, the way they fought as if their lives depended on it. It all pointed to a truth that Salvek wasn't sure he was ready to accept. Humans didn't fight for conquest. They fought because they had no other choice. Something had forced them to become like this. Something had pushed them beyond the limits of normal evolution, had made them this efficient, this ruthless. And that something, it might still be out there. Salvek had once believed the Dominion was the most dominant force in the galaxy, but now he wasn't so sure. If the humans had endured something the Dominion had never faced, if they had learned to fight like this not out of ambition, but out of necessity, then what did that mean for the rest of the galaxy? Were they living in a fragile illusion of safety while humanity prepared for a war that had never truly ended? Salvek exhaled, his claws tightening at his sides. "What did you fight?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds remained silent for a long time, his gaze distant, as if looking at something Salvek couldn't see. Then, with a slow breath, he finally spoke, "Something that doesn't stop." The word sent a shiver down Salvek's spine, because for the first time in his life, he realized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology, their weapons, or even their resilience. It was their fear. Fear that had shaped them into something relentless. Fear that had turned survival into an art. Fear that had made them the most terrifying species the galaxy had never truly understood. And if that fear still existed, then whatever had created it was still out there, waiting. Salvek had spent his life believing in the unshakable power of the Vrogan Dominion, believing that their strength, their war machines, and their conquests made them the ultimate force in the galaxy. But now, as he stood watching the humans, as he listened to Reynolds' words sink into his mind like a slow, creeping poison, he felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. The idea that the Dominion might not be the strongest species in the universe had never crossed his mind. Yet here it was, staring him in the face. These humans, these seemingly fragile creatures, had been forged in a war that had left invisible scars. A war so terrible that even now, generations later, their training wasn't about dominance, wasn't about power. It was about survival. And that terrified him. Whatever had hunted them, whatever had forced them to refine their combat into something so instinctive, so brutally efficient, must have been something beyond anything the Dominion had ever faced. Salvek wanted to believe it was an exaggeration, a story to make humans seem more dangerous than they really were. But the look in Reynolds' eyes told him otherwise. It was the look of someone who had seen something that could never be forgotten. "You don't want to know," Reynolds had said before, but now Salvek did want to know. Because if humanity had fought something that didn't stop, something that had shaped them into this, then the galaxy was sitting on the edge of an abyss it didn't even realize existed. And worse, what if that thing wasn't gone? What if it was still out there, waiting in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to return? A chilling thought crept into Salvek's mind, unbidden and unwelcome. Perhaps humanity wasn't training for war against the Dominion. Perhaps they weren't preparing to fight the rest of the galaxy at all. Maybe they were preparing for the day that nightmare came back. And if that was true, then the Dominion, the entire galaxy, might not be as safe as they had always believed. Salvek's chest felt tight, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just realized. The Dominion had always viewed humans as an anomaly, a young species that had survived against the odds, but nothing more. Now he understood the terrible truth. They weren't just survivors. They were preparing. Their training, their instincts, the way they constantly analyzed their surroundings as if expecting an attack, it wasn't the behavior of conquerors or even traditional warriors. It was the behavior of people who knew that danger never truly disappeared, that threats could return at any moment. And if that was the case, then the real question wasn't whether humanity was a danger to the Dominion. The real question was what had hunted them so relentlessly that even now, after reaching the stars, they still couldn't afford to let their guard down. Salvek wanted answers, but for the first time, he was afraid of them. What if he wasn't ready to know? What if the Dominion, for all its power, was just another blind civilization living in ignorant peace, while humanity stood at the edge of an unseen battlefield, waiting for the enemy that had shaped them into what they were? He turned to Reynolds again, his voice lower, more hesitant than he had ever imagined it could be. "Is it still out there?" He expected a dismissive answer, expected Reynolds to laugh or shake his head, to tell him that humanity had already defeated their greatest enemy. But Reynolds didn't laugh. He didn't shake his head. Instead, his expression darkened, his jaw tightening slightly, and in that silence, Solvik had his answer. The nightmare wasn't over. The threat that had created humanity's unyielding nature hadn't been destroyed. It had only been delayed. "We don't know," Reynolds admitted at last, his voice quiet but heavy. "But we train because we can't afford to be wrong." Solvik felt a chill settle into his bones. The Dominion had spent centuries believing they were the greatest power in the galaxy. But if humanity was right, if something was still out there, then strength alone wouldn't be enough to survive what was coming. Solvik felt the weight of Reynolds' words settle over him like a dark cloud. "We train because we can't afford to be wrong." That simple statement carried a depth of meaning that made his blood run cold. The Vrogan had always trained for war, but war was predictable. Strategies, tactics, overwhelming force. What the humans trained for was something else entirely. They trained as if their very survival depended on instincts honed over generations, as if they expected the enemy to be something that could not be reasoned with, could not be negotiated with, something that would come in the dead of night and leave nothing behind but silence. And if that was true, then the Dominion's arrogance had blinded them to a truth that had been lurking in the shadows all along. Solvik had thought this meeting was about assessing humanity as a potential threat or ally, but now he understood. This wasn't about humanity at all. It was about what had shaped them, what had forced them to become this way. And if humanity, with all their advancements, their numbers, and their relentless training, still feared it, then the Dominion should have been afraid too. He looked around at the human soldiers, watching the way they moved, silent, disciplined, prepared. They weren't just warriors. They were survivors of something the rest of the galaxy had never faced, and they knew something that no one else did. A terrible thought settled into Solvik's mind, one he couldn't shake. If the Dominion didn't start preparing the way humans had, if they ignored the warnings hidden in the way these people lived, then when the enemy returned, because it would return, the Vrogan, and possibly the entire galaxy, would be nothing more than the next victims. He exhaled slowly, turning back to Reynolds, his voice no longer filled with doubt or arrogance, but something far more dangerous, understanding. "Then teach us," Solvik said, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about conquest or power. He was thinking about survival. Reynolds studied Solvik for a long moment, his sharp human eyes scanning the Vrogan commander as if assessing whether he truly understood what he was asking. For centuries, the Dominion had believed itself to be the ultimate force in the galaxy, unchallenged and unrivaled. And yet here Solvik stood, no longer the proud, confident warrior he had been when he arrived. He was different now. He had seen something, understood something, and it had shaken him to his core. Reynolds let the silence stretch between them, letting Solvik feel the weight of his own words. "Then teach us." The request was simple, but the implications were massive. If the Dominion truly wanted to learn, it meant accepting that their way of thinking, their entire philosophy of war, had been flawed. It meant tearing down their arrogance and rebuilding from the ground up. And that wasn't something that could be done overnight. "Teaching you means unlearning everything you think you know," Reynolds finally said, his voice calm but firm. "It means understanding that strength isn't what keeps you alive. It's how fast you adapt when strength fails." Solvik's claws twitched slightly, his reptilian features unreadable, but Reynolds could tell the words hit their mark. This was not an easy thing for a Vrogan to accept. Their species had always believed in raw power, in sheer dominance. To be told that power wasn't enough must have felt like an insult to everything they had built. But to Salvik's credit, he didn't argue. He simply nodded, slowly, as if wrestling with the truth that had just been laid before him. "Then show us," Salvik said, his voice quieter than before. "Because if we are wrong, we will not survive." Reynolds exhaled, his expression unreadable. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just about training the Vrogan. It was about preparing the entire galaxy. Because deep down, in the place where his worst fears lurked, he knew one thing to be true. Humanity had been given a rare gift, time. But time was running out. And when they returned, when the nightmare that had shaped humanity finally reappeared, there would be no second chances. The rest of the galaxy had to be ready, or it would burn. Salvik felt the weight of Reynolds' words settle over him like an unseen force, pressing against the very core of his being. The Dominion had spent centuries believing war was a test of strength, of dominance, of proving who could stand at the top of the food chain. But now, standing before this human commander, he saw the truth. War had never been the true test. Survival was, and humanity had been tested in ways no other species could comprehend. They had trained, adapted, and sharpened themselves not for conquest, but for something far worse. Something that didn't stop. Something that had nearly erased them once, and might come back to finish what it started. The thought sent an unfamiliar chill through Salvik's spine. The idea that an enemy existed that even the Dominion, proud, powerful, undefeated, might not be able to fight was terrifying. But what was even more terrifying was the realization that humanity had known this all along. They had lived with this fear, carried it through generations, turned it into the very foundation of their existence, and they had never told anyone, because no one would have believed them. His throat tightened as the full picture became clear. The humans had never been silent out of weakness. They had been silent because the rest of the galaxy was too blind, too arrogant to listen. They had watched as empires waged petty wars, as species fought over borders, as civilizations squabbled over power, knowing that none of it would matter when they returned. The Vrogan had mocked humans for their paranoia, for their relentless training, for their strange, obsessive need to prepare for wars that never came. Now, Salvik understood. The wars had never stopped for them. He met Reynolds' gaze, seeing something in the human's eyes he had never noticed before. It wasn't just confidence. It wasn't just discipline. It was the weight of knowing a truth that no one else wanted to face. And for the first time, Salvik didn't see humans as weak, as unpredictable, as reckless. He saw them for what they truly were, the only species in the galaxy that understood what was coming. And if the Dominion wanted to survive, if the galaxy itself wanted to stand a chance, then there was only one path forward. "Then we listen," Salvik said, his voice steady, his fate sealed. "Tell us what we must do."